8. The large forest elf camp at the top of the hill was not an instance map generated only for players in the middle of a quest, so it was perfectly plausible for multiple parties to find themselves there at the same time. In addition to that, it was also possible for them to get into a fight over who was allowed to finish their quest first. But with only a few dozen players this far ahead in the game, the odds of that happening were slim. As far as I knew, Asa and I, the DKB, were the only ones following the Elf War quest line at the moment. Was this some kind of internal squabble in the DKB? I didn't want to get any closer, but even in the few seconds I watched, the two groups were getting visibly heated. If they raised any more noise, the elf warriors atop the hill would notice and be on alert. Reluctantly, I climbed over the lip of the cliff, feeling it was necessary to get a better idea of what was happening. I was at the western edge of the hill, a semicircle protruding to the south. The dozen or so players were congregated at the southern end. There were only a few bushes, at best, for cover in the straight line between us, so I couldn't approach directly. My best bet was to head into the forest surrounding the hill and swing to the southeast, avoiding the gnarled roots and shrubs along the way. Thanks to my recent life in the forest, I managed to circle around my destination in less than a minute without tripping over any roots. The massive trees at the lip of the hill were ideal for hiding, so I hugged the back of the particularly thick trunk and activated my hiding skill before peering around. A small path ran east and west at the foot of the hill and branched over to the north to a climb toward the camp. At the T intersection, actually an upside-down T from my perspective, the two groups glared at each other. There were 6 on the east side, while the west side there were over 10. If this was the DKB infighting, this had to represent about the entire guild. Based on what I could see by the dim moonlight, they hadn't drawn their swords yet. But some members did have hands on their hilts of their weapons, and there were raw anger in the open air. The furious shouts and insults before had stopped, but the mood seemed even more tense because of it. One of the players from the east side of the intersection stepped forward. His long hair was tied behind his head, and a slender scimitar was strapped around his waist. This was clearly Lind, the leader of the Dragon Knights Brigade. I could only see his silhouette from my position, but it seemed like an angular outline to his face was even more tense than usual. Lind stared at the opposing party and spoke quietly. "There's no use of us continuing to argue about this. We reached a point first. As the rules state, we have the right to proceed with this quest before you." It felt like a very stuffy, formal statement for an internal argument. And sure enough, another man leapt out from the other group, jabbing an accusatory finger at Lind. "First? You only beat us by a couple seconds at best." I nearly gasped in astonishment, but closed my mouth just in time. That morning star-like spiked hair, long sword at his back, and aggressive Kanzai dialect, it could only be none other than Cabal, the leader of Aincrad Liberation Squad. Which meant that the dozen or so players across from Lind's half-dozen were the ALS. But why were they here? Cabal's next outraged bellow halfway answered that question. "What do you mean the rules? If you made them up yourself, we don't gotta play along. We've got to beat this assault quest too, no matter what it takes." Beat this assault quest. The words were loud and clear. So the ALS were on the elf campaign too, and on the dark elf side to boot. But this is the field boss of the battle that day. Well, the day before, ALS members had seemed disinterested in the campaign when I'd asked about it. That left 2 possibilities. Either all members of the guild were ordered to keep quiet about it, or they'd started the campaign yesterday afternoon and reached the 6th chapter already just in 12 hours. I couldn't believe the latter. The Jade Key quest was not over the span of a single battle, but Vanishing Spiders, the Flower Offering, and Emergency Orders, and the Missing Soldier couldn't all be completed in half a day without the presence of someone who truly knew what they were doing. Perhaps a former beta tester was taking the lead. Which they had. Yes, the ALS had a member who fit that profile too. Morte, the coif-wearing who had traded blows with me just minutes before, a little ways down the river. He'd hidden his face and switched his weapons in order to slip into both guilds. If he was the guide of the DKB, nothing that said he couldn't do the same for the ALS. So Cabal beseeched Morte's assistant in order to blaze through all the quests in the campaign up until this point. But he was as steadfast in his stance not to associate with former beta testers. Why would he ignore that philosophy so suddenly? Confused, I watched the two leaders face off. Now it was Lynn's turn to turn loose. Whether it's quest or hunting grounds, first come, first served is the obvious way of things. If you're going to be a leader of a guild, you've got to follow your good conscience, Cabal. At this haughty, sweeping statement by Lynn's standards, Cabal flashed his canines in a snarl. Conscience? You're gonna talk to me about conscience? Lind? He crossed his thick arms and leaned back, staring up at Lynn's face with a menace in his eyes. Well, I got a bone to pick about that. Ever since we got here, you've been hiding the fact that this elf quest is crucial to beating the floor boss? What? I clamped my mouth and shut it before the startled exclamation could burst out and into the virtual night. Certainly, proceeding through the campaign carried its own rewards, such as money, experience, and loot, but it certainly wasn't necessary to beat the boss. The chamber door in the Labyrinth Tower would be open whether the quest was active or not. The boss was available to fight, and if defeated, the way of the fourth floor was open. At least that's how it was in the beta. But it was also that way in the first two floors in the retail game. And even if I had changed the third floor, nobody here could have possibly known that fact for a fact yet. But Cabal continued his rant, full of the righteous anger and one absolutely convinced of his facts. You remember what happened 5 days ago. The raid nearly got wiped out because we didn't know the boss cow had turned into 3. That's the same trap that'd been laid here on the 3rd floor. Some trap that's gonna do us in if we ain't cleared the elf quest and got whatever item it gives out. You knew it was true, and you didn't say a word of it during the strategy meeting. So where's your conscience now, huh? No. I had to prevent myself from screaming right along with Lind. At the very least, none of the quests in the campaign I completed in the 3rd floor in the beta had any bearing on the boss. It was possible that the rewards had been altered since then, but the only ones that could confirm it were those who completed all 10 chapters available on this floor, and it was unthinkable that anyone could have done that, much in the 4 days. It was one thing to rush through the early quests, but the 9th and 10th were long affairs that required an entire day to complete, which meant this hypothetical life-saving item Cabal was talking about was probably a false info someone had maliciously fed to him. And I had a bad feeling I knew who would do that. No, I don't know what you're talking about, Lynn shouted, breaking me out of my thoughts. I focused on the scene ahead of me, and even from this distance I could make out the folds on his brow as he glared back at Cabal. The DKB have only been doing the campaign quest for the experience and rewards. I didn't mention it because there was no reason to bring it up. And the rewards are items we'll need to beat the boss, no doubt. Cabal shot back, leaning forward and meeting Lynn's gaze furiously. You just want to call the shots for all the frontline players, that's all. Well, I ain't gonna let you tell me the rules. We're going first, so wait here like good lil boys. Cabal turned forcefully towards the hill, but Lin's hand caught his shoulder. Instantly, the guild members behind both men bristled. Wait! Don't do this! Maybe you're not aware of this, but these key spots disappear when someone completes the quest, only to reappear elsewhere at random. If we wait here, won't be able to finish the quest after you. At this, Cabal reached up and grabbed Lin's shirt at the chest. This is what I mean about you not sharing details. What you're saying is that if you do the quest first, then we don't get to do it. As is our right for being the first to the camp. And I'm telling you, I ain't following your rules. If you want, we can set up some rules that make this whole kit and caboodle real simple. And what do you mean by that? Oh no. They were both absolutely furious. Shivata in the DKB might be able to step in before things got truly dangerous, but there was no officer with a similarly cool head on the ALS side. I certainly couldn't improve the situation by trying to interfere now. But what options were available to defuse this perilous situation? I gritted my teeth hard. Suddenly, Lin's words from just a moment ago replayed within my head. These key spots disappear once someone completes the quest. From what I heard later, Cabal and Lin stood there holding the other, neither backing down an inch, and all 18 players present nearly ended up in a foot race up the hill to see who could ransack the Forest Elf camp first. As allies of the Forest Elves, the DKB were supposed to deliver supplies from home base camp to the captain in charge of the camp, but the ALS, working the Dark Elf storyline, needed to steal the commander's orders. It's the same as me. Meaning that if both guilds charged in at once, the dozen-plus Forest Elf warriors in camp would be friendly NPCs to the DKCB, but powerful, yet not much as elite types like Kismel, monsters to the ALS. If that happened, Lin's party of 6 would witness an open battle between Cabal's dozen and the Forest Elves. How would the DKB react? The most sensible reaction would be to ignore the allied NPCs and deliver the supplies to the captain, thus completing the quest. It wasn't clear if the camp would simply vanish on the spot as soon as the quest ended, or if the captain would be able to accept the supplies if he's stuck in combat, but at least that would do a little damage as possible to the frontline group as a whole. But depending on the mental state of Lind and DKB, the worst was also possible, siding with the Forest Elves and turning their swords on the ALS. If the 6 DKB members joined into the dozen or so to the Forest Elves, their power would be about equal to the 12 ALS warriors. Since they weren't going to calmly challenge each other through the duel system, players on either side would turn into the orange criminal players. At that point, there would be a no stopping the infighting. We might be on the verge of our first top player killed since the first floor boss battle, and at the hands of another player. If that happened, the frontline clears would never again be a unified group. Fortunately, that dire outcome from the state of our advancement in the game was avoided at the last moment. Just as Cabal and Lind began to climb the hill, each trying to push the other back, the elf camp simply disappeared, as though by magic. Though, according to SAO's story, it probably was elven magic. The two guild leaders and their 16 followers all comically locked in place in sprinting poses and stared dumbfounded at the top of the hill. Eventually, a single player came trotting down the moonlit path. The moment they saw the face of the player who'd just beaten both guilds to the punch completed the quest camp, no doubt that all present had one thought in their minds. Not him again. Faced with 18 pairs of eyes, I was much less comfortable than I let on. As soon as I made up my mind to beat them in the quest, I took the following actions. I ran back through the forest the way I'd come, only several times faster, then sped along the river until I was directly beneath the camp. From there, I scrambled up the 20-foot cliff. Once inside the camp, I made my way around the present guard routines and snuck into the captain's tent. Careful not to wake the sleeping leader in the back, I snatched the sheet of orders off the table in the center of the tent. Once out of the open again, I retraced my steps around the guards and descended the cliff to behind the camp. It sounded simple when put like that, but if I hadn't learned the details from someone else during the beta test, I would certainly have been spotted in the process. Once I set foot back down on the riverside mud and the quest log updated, I nearly fell to the ground with a leaf. A part of me wanted to just slip away, return to the base, but if I was going to help avert disaster between the DKB and the ALS, I couldn't just spirit the camp away and leave it. It had to be made clear that someone had to complete the quest, or good as complete, since it wasn't official until I reported to the Dark Elf commander. So I climbed back up the cliff again, where the entire camp was vanishing in a poof of green light. Anyone else who wanted to finish the infiltration quest or deliver supplies to the Forest Elf captain would have to find the camp in its new randomized location. Following the new marker on their maps, no matter where it appeared, there would be a way to sneak in the rear. But this cliff climb location was the only one I knew well. Even Argo the Rat would have a difficult time providing detailed maps for this part of her strategy guide series. I crossed the hilltop, now bare even a single fence, and descended the path to the foot of the hill. Stopping a slight distance away from the stunned looks of two guilds, I opened my window to check the time. It had taken just under 5 minutes to steal the commander's orders, traversal time included, meaning that Lind and Cabal had spent at least that much extra time trying to convince each other of his logic since I left the scene. Sadly for them, that effort had gone to waste. Window closed and my hands in my pockets, I tried to put on as casual an attitude as I could. Sorry, I just finished the quest. You'll have to look at the camp elsewhere. Len's face went pale when Cabal's only grew darker. By the light of the moon, it was hard to tell which of them was angrier. As I might have suspected, the first to speak was Cabal, he of the blinding rage against all former beta testers. No wonder I ain't seen ya around. The little beater boy was busy with the campaign. And just like this fool with the top knot, you know we needed a quest reward to beat the boss. And didn't see fit to tell anyone. Cabal elbowed one of the DKB cohorts out of the way and glared back and forth at me and Lind. In the end, y'all don't give a fig for rescuing all 8,000 folks trapped in this game. That's all secondary to ya. You're only among the top players, so y'all can get your weapons and items and lord them over the rest of us. Nothing more. You just all over beaters. What's up vanish the town of beginnings. Up in the very first day. You ain't got right to pretend you're inheriting DFL's lead. He'd been keeping his volume low prior to this, but now that the camp was gone, all restraint went out the window. As Cabal's torrent of rage spilled forth, the ALS members at his back shouted encouragement and called Lind a cosplay freak. The taunts about Diovel's will and cosplay were aimed squarely at Lind, who had dyed his hair blue in honor of the late night. Even after it had snuck and nicked the quest from under their noses, their rage was still focused on the DKB. Lind's face was clearly pale, even under the moonlight. His slender eyes were burning with anger, and his teeth were gritted hard. But he did not explode in any kind. He held out his hand to stifle any returned shouts from the DKB team. Perhaps he felt ashamed of his attempts to force their way ahead of the camp. In any case, he showed great restraint in holding back. But the internal tension must have been unbelievably high. He sucked in a deep breath and held it for several seconds, and let it out, then spoke his voice, tense but low. Cabal, I will repeat myself. None of the DKB members, including me, had any idea the reward from the campaign quest would be crucial in defeating the boss. Where did you get this information? But Cabal, still in the midst of the outburst of rage, ignored the question. Nice try, but he ain't falling for it. You're just thinking you can monopolize all that info for yourselves. I just told you, that is not the case. They headed into a fresh round of angry bursts. I watched the back and forth, frustrated by this turn of events. The clears might be a handy shorthand for the term those players who were active advancing our progress in the game, but they were not a unified force. There were DKB, a group hand-picked elites. The ALS focused on expanding their group, agile neutral team, and then me, the outcast beater. And my partner, Asana. On top of that, there were Morte, who, for some reason unknown, was moonlighting in both guilds to get them advanced in the campaign, and the person, or people, acting as his dueling partner. Ironically, I recalled Kisma's stories about the background of this world and how humans had split into 9 different nations. Lind, Cabal, I said. They stopped butting heads long enough to glare at me. There were no magic words that would heal the wounds between these two groups, and they were far too apart for that. And all the magic they had lost in this castle since the great separation of old, all the foolish remnants of humanity could do was make use of what they could. You both know I'm a beater, so I know what rewards the Elf War quests are and what effects they have. But I'm not rushing through the campaign for the rewards. I'm doing it for the level up and strengthen my equipment so I can beat the floor boss. I'm sure you didn't go through the trouble of the guild quest just so you could squabble like this. As soon as I stopped speaking, Cabal jabbed an index finger at me.
Don't talk back to me just after you slipped and stole this quest like some kind of sneak thief. How are you gonna prove you're not after the item rewards? Even as we stand here, I know that deep down you're just dying to get on to the next quest.
I'm stopping the campaign at this point, I said flatly. Cabal growled a wordless question, and Lynn squinted at me, his brow furrowing. I removed my hand from my coat pocket and jabbed my thumb behind me, up the gentle hill and far into the distance, where the dark silhouette of the labyrinth tower loomed. I'm about to start tackling the labyrinth, and while you're stuck in the campaign quagmire, bickering every step of the way, I'll be ransacking all the chests and ores in the tower. Remember, I'm a beater. Don't expect me to leave you anything good. And if you don't catch up by the boss chamber, I'll gather my own group of players and take him down. I'm a beater and a front runner, and I'll do things however I please. I stopped talking and put my hand down, but no one spoke up. The silence that covered the hill had to be 20% surprise, 30% anger, and 50% exasperation. Even I felt like I was overdoing it with this speech, but it was necessary to bring this tension under control. Again, it was Cabal who reacted first. You got to the 6th chapter of this quest, and now you're gonna abandon it. That's right, I confirmed, feeling a guilty throb deep in my chest. It was heartbreaking to leave in the middle of this lengthy quest sequence. There were 10 on this floor, and dozens if you counted everything up to its finale on the 9th floor. The system would allow me to come back and resume after finishing the labyrinth, but I expected Cabal to demand that I destroy the commander's orders I'd just stolen to prove I wasn't secretly after rewards. Once that story item was gone, I could never complete the infiltration quest. That wasn't the only thing. Giving up on the campaign quest here meant leaving Kismel behind. Her help in our activities the last few days was predicated upon our assistance of the Dark Elves' advanced force in their fight against the Forest Elves. If we abandoned that mission, she would have no cause to help us anymore. But that was just how big the campaign quest lines worked. If a single quest was a book, then a campaign was a series that spanned several volumes. As long as we were in the process of reading that series, we were still within the story. But close the book, and the setting and characters were out of reach. The items and experience were just window dressing. And the true value of the campaign quest, how it gave flesh and blood to the virtual setting and turned into a story. As I hung my head, feeling gloomy, a high-pitched cry stabbed my ears.
That's impossible!
I looked up and saw a man in the midst of the ALS crowd, waving a fist around as he screamed. His skinny torso was clothed in moss-green tunic of the guild and the dark studded leather, and wore a leather mask of the same color, which covered his face except for his eyes and mouth. He was obscured by the other members, so I couldn't see his weapon. The man's screech was strangely familiar.
He's full of it. You can't get to the boss chamber on your own. He's just pretending to go back to the labyrinth so he can finish the campaign behind our backs.
The other ALS members and some of the DKB started to rustle uneasily. From what I could make out of their voices, most were skeptical of my statement. The skinny man screeched again.
Don't let that beater lie to you. He's the reason Diavel died. Ignore him and focus on the campaign.
Shut up, Joe, Cabal grumbled, and the masked man named Joe grudgingly lowered his arm. The opening gave Lind a chance to speak. I am well aware of your skill, Kirito, but even you cannot conquer the labyrinth on your own. I'm not in total agreement with the ALS, but I do find it hard to believe that you have given up on the campaign. As a former tester, you understand the benefit of completing an extended quest series. Besides, his sharp eyes scanned the area. Where is your partner? What if she took the story item and ran off to complete the quest while you're occupying our attention here? I was completely off the mark, but difficult to deny. My partner, temporary party member technically, was back at the Dark Elf base, sleeping in the tent next to Kismel. There was no way to spirit her to prove my innocence. I had no choice to stay silent, as both guilds hurried accusations in my direction. As the volume grew louder and louder, I was struck by a faint déjà vu. It was the same kind of massive public condemnation that sounded Neza in the Legend Braves after admitting his upgrading scam just and the second floor boss battle. After then, the cries had eventually demanded his life as payment. If other Braves hadn't gone down on hands and knees and apologized to him, someone might actually have drawn their sword on Nessa. Now that I thought about it, one of the reasons that terrible tense scene had come about was the mysterious man in the black poncho who taught the Braves about the trick to swindle others through the upgrade system. His presence seemed eerily similar to that of Mortes in this case. Is it possible that they were the same person? If that was the case, Mortes' motivations were definitely evil. He'd convinced both guilds to take part of the elf quest in the opposite sides and got them to collide at that hill. And that meant he was hiding at the riverside, hoping to prevent anyone, meaning me, from completing the quest and causing the camp to disappear. But what did he possibly stand to gain by pitting the DKB and the ALS against each other? While we weren't a unified group, the frontline players had successfully beaten the first and second floors, and were just about to reach the third labyrinth. Weakening the group with infighting would only delay our ability to beat this game and escape. It would have much wider effect than just PKing me. Did Morte not want to escape this digital prison? Could anyone really think that way?
Say something!
Came the high-pitched screech again. I raised my head. The man Cabal called Joe was shouting, his eyes blazing through the holes on the mask.
Where is she? I bet she's rushing ahead to finish all the quests before anyone else, and if not, bring her out here and prove it!
It was not me who answered the challenge, or Cabal, or Lind. A voice, quiet but strong-willed, carried through the night air of the forest from the back of the group.
If it's me you want, I'm right here.
Later. Much, much later. Asuna told me if someone had drawn their sword, I might have gone orange, with a grin on her face. Fortunately, it did not rain blood, but there was a fresh, different kind of tension that just gripped the scene. Both guilds were quite shocked, of course, but that was worth nothing compared to me. For an instant, I thought I had to be imagining the voice. I stood dumbfounded on the path halfway up the hill, staring at the wall of players ahead. Eventually, the ALS members moved right and the DKB members moved left, as though pushed by some invisible force. The opening path split east and west as the foot of the hills, and there was a thick forest beyond that. Right across from the T intersection was a particular wide ancient tree that dwarfed the others. From around the rear of the tree, whose trunk I had just been hiding behind, I spied the group only minutes ago. A single figure emerged. A red-hooded cape tinged with gray, a dark crimson tunic, and a leather skirt, and at her waist a silver rapier that glinted and shone bright, even in the dim of the moonlight. If she was hiding behind that same tree, then she couldn't have been there all along. But only during the 10 minutes I snuck around into the camp, I speculated, to little benefit of our point. Lind and Cabal joined the others in stepping back. With the other path entirely clear, the intruder coolly stepped forward. Underneath her rippling hood, the light brown eyes were firm and resolute. There was no way to read the emotions within. Asana the fencer, sole woman of the frontline population, and my current partner, stopped at my right side and spun around theatrically, then spoke to the crowd, her voice crisp and clear. As his partner, I too will be heading for the labyrinth. Once there, we will be looking for the boss chamber. As I recall, whoever finds it gets to be the raid leader. At that, both Lind and Cabal went pale, and the other 16 stirred and muttered. In a way, her statement was even more grandiose than mine, but no one stepped up with accusations. This time, partly because of the surprise of her sudden entrance, and partly because of her sheer presence of that glittering chivalric rapier on her belt, the Night Soar, far better than even my Neilblade Plus 8, unleashed a ghostly pressure in the bluish light of the moon. This reminded me that I was planning to inform the group that the elf base camp were capable of forging weapons, just as good during the meeting 4 days ago, but didn't get the chance after Lynn demanded that we join the guild separately. Of course, if I had done that, all the guild forces would have immediately set upon the campaign quest, and this exact scene might have played out in the same way, only with twice the people involved. Just as I started to distract myself by planning to study the strange, unfriendly blacksmith more before revealing my findings to the group, it happened.
I know the truth! In the first and second floors, they didn't bother to help nap the tower! They just went around opening all the leftover chests! There's no way that going from 1 to 2 will make the difference in getting them to the boss room! Again, the screech belonged to Joe from the ALS. Now that the group had shifted right, I could see his entire form. Hanging from his skinny waist was a sharply curved dagger. I recognized it as a numb dagger, a rare drop from the Minotaur on the second floor labyrinth that had occasional chance to stun upon hitting an enemy. Now I knew him as a dagger user. The memory came back to me. Joe was the one who claimed that Nez's upgrade scam had caused someone to die, as well as the one who accused me of being a former beta tester back on the first floor. Sadly, I couldn't put his face to memory because of the mask. But based on his open antagonism, that was a name I needed to know. I felt slightly ashamed that it had taken me this long. My worst habit and weakness was my tendency not to look at others' faces or bother to remember their names. Someday, that was going to put me in danger. I focused on skinny, short Joe, burning his image into my mind. Once I was certain that I would remember him the next time I saw him, I finally opened my mouth to speak for the first time in 2 minutes. If you think we can reach the boss chamber on our own, Joe, then why don't you just let us go? We're going into the labyrinth, just as we announced. I'm gonna let you go. Come on, Kiba. Let's stop wasting our time and move on to the next. The obnoxious shriek was cut off by a stern glare from his guild leader. Don't make me repeat myself, Joe. Shut your damn mouth, Cabal growled, and then turned to me and Asuna. He scratched at his cactus hair and grumbled. I just don't know what's what anymore. You really think you can handle the boss without the campaign quest reward? If there's any chance at all we need him to tackle the boss, it ain't too late to find out what.
You have a point, I agreed, and stared appraisingly at each leader in turn. But if testing out the reward of the loot is truly your aim, then either the DKB or ALS should abandon the quest. If you attempt to complete the Dark Elf and Forest Elf factions at the same time, you will clash again. Like tonight, if you can discuss the matter and determine which of the two will step down, I'm willing to wait until we've done our homework. Once again, the two guild leaders and their cohorts went pale. Joe was obviously ready to screech another accusation, but the greatsword user next to him yanked on his arm to shut him up. In truth, I wanted to announce that one man had successfully convinced both guilds to start on the campaign, but alas, I had no proof that the swordsman Morte, who had just joined the DKB, was the same person as the axe warrior I saw in Cabal's party in the cave. If I made the accusation on uncertain evidence, it would only complicate the situation. I watched the two leaders closely, hiding my desperate prayer behind a careful crafted sour expression. If Morte's aim was to pit the guild against each other, then I needed to prevent the group of clears from breaking apart. It wasn't out of some great desire for justice, I just knew that Morte was my sworn enemy. This was a continuation of our duel, playing out in a very different battleground. Kimbao and Lind shared a look for about 2 seconds, then snorted simultaneously. The ALS leader looked away in a huff, and the DKB boss turned to me and shook his head. I'm afraid that will be impossible, Kirito. Perhaps if we were just starting, but we've both reached the 6th chapter of the quest line. We would be losing out on too much to stop now. I resisted the urge to drop my shoulders in disappointment and nodded with the same stoic look on my face. I see. Then while you two are butting heads, we will be racing through the labyrinth. It's a shame, but I have to assume you are bluffing. The game's labyrinths are not so easy that a party of two can reach the boss. Even if that were to happen to be you two. I realize that this is not the best time to ask, but have you considered on giving up on your stubborn refusal yet? Perhaps the time is right to stop insisting on your solo play and join a guild. As I stated the other day, however, you cannot both join the same guild in the interest of balance. You're going to bring that up now? Seriously? I went pale. Separate guilds was just the magic phrase that would set Asuna off. As I feared, the moment he said that, the silent fencer took a menacing step forward. But what she said took me by surprise. It's not just the two of us. Before I even had time to wonder, the space just left me, died in the pale blue moonlight silently split open. I'd seen this phenomenon of space turning inside out 4 nights earlier in the forests outside of Zumfoot. Well, technically, I only heard the rustling of the cape from behind me, but it was clearly the same ability at work. Only one person could be successful in hiding in full moonlight, in the middle of an empty field, with the watchful eyes of nearly 20 players, for several minutes without being spotted. The cloak with the invisibility charm parted left and right, and a sheer, shiny head of the pale purple hair, like fine silk, caught the moonlight. Next came an elegant breastplate of the black metal with purple inlay. In her left hand and at her hip were a kite shield and a longsword, both with the rich shine of mithril. The bare skin of her arms, legs appeared to be a deep navy blue in the darkness. When she raised her head triumphantly, her side bangs rustled lightly, revealing a stunning beauty and long, narrow ears. Her onyx eyes stared down the speechless group, and the third member of our party spoke in a sharp voice.
I am Kismel, a royal knight of the Pagoda Knights Brigade, in service of the Kingdom of Lysula.
She extended her right arm from the cape in the direction of me and Asuna.
I have pledged my support to the human warriors Kirito and Asuna as they venture forth to the Pillar of Heavens. Even the stoutest guardians within the tower shall be as helpless as the morning dew before my blade.
If they were at the sixth quest of the campaign, both the DKB and ALS must have recognized the name Kismel mentioned as nation beneath the Dark Elf Queen's rule. The Pillar of Heavens was descriptive enough to be an obvious term for the Labyrinth Tower. What I couldn't tell was exactly why every guild member present was stunned into silence, whether it was Kismel's beauty or the fact that an NPC knew our names, or the overwhelming power level of the 16 elite monster. Probably all above, I decided. Lynn staggered back into a step or two, his face as pale as ice. Are you sure you want to stand there, Kirito? Huh? Why wouldn't I?
That dark elf cursor is pitch black. She must be a higher level than even the elite mobs from the very first quest.
Now I understood. To me and Asuna and the ALS on the Dark Elf side of the campaign, Kismel's color cursor was a yellow shade that signified an NPC. But Lind and the DKB were on the Forest Elf side, so it would be the red of an enemy monster. Depending on the level difference between the player and target, a red cursor would change shades all the way from light pink to dark crimson. Now that the elite knight had leveled up during our time together, she must have seemed nearly black to level 15 Lind. Gabao glanced back and forth from retreating Lind to Kismel, cloak rippling in the night breeze. He took a few steps backwards himself and hissed at his rival. Hey, is it true her cursor's black? Yes, I doubt we could defeat her as an entire party. That's crazy! How'd they get such a whopper to work with them? He moaned. Kismel must have heard him because she turned to me and whispered, Your human language is even more complex than I knew. That was probably a comment on Kibao's Kanzai dialect. Whatever language engine Kismel AI must work only with standard Japanese, so half of Kibao's words had to be indecipherable to her. I chuckled briefly, then realized something. The group had been throwing around technical terms about the game, quests, campaign, story items, and so on. They're all pointed to the truth of the matter. This was a virtual world, existing only within a server in a real world. They suggested that the floating castle of Einkrad was not a slice of the real world set adrift into the sky by the Great Separation, but was a mere setting of this VR MMO game called Sword Art Online. Of course, Kismel had no knowledge of any of this. She was born and raised in this world as a dark elf, and fought her way to knighthood. Who knew how she interpreted the words of the game's players? Could we be certain that her interpretation did not do any damage to the AI controlling her? Lind and Cabal stepped down to the hill to rejoin their partners, coming together for a deep discussion. Now was the time to say to Kismel what I hadn't been able to say, assuming I really thought of her not as an NPC assistant, but as a partner, a friend. Kismel, I muttered. There must have been something telling in my voice, for the Dark Elf Knight and the Fencer both turned to look at me. Listen, neither Asuna nor I were born in this castle. We were brought here from a far-off place. We're fighting to get back to our home world. Asuna sucked in a sharp breath. I reached out to brush the back of Kismel's hand, facing her directly. The elf knight stared back at me, slightly puzzled. There was no way to know what kind of information processing was happening behind those onyx black pools. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. Perhaps the GM will show up out of nowhere, pull her away, and reinitialize her. After an eternity of silent seconds, Kismel's luscious lips parted. Of course I know that. Huh?
I chose not to ask you about it until now. It was the last great charm that humanity has, is it not? To summon warriors from foreign land and have them fight to unify all pillars of heaven as one. We dark elves are much the same. We carry on long battles to protect all the secret keys from the forest elves and to preserve the seal on the sanctuary. I guess so? Kismel's description was a simple interpretation of the SAO incident in terms that made sense of the setting of the game. But I didn't see any reason to go overturning her understanding in order to make it clear to her. Instead, I agreed with her explanation, and she smiled. We have teleportation charms that allow us to travel between the floors, so we are of no use to the Pillar of Heavens that you humans are so fixated upon. However, if you wish, I will assist you in your quest, but only for a price. Her smile grew wider, and she looked back and forth at us. Tell me of the land where you were born someday, what your families were like, and how you were raised. Yeah, sure, I promise, I said, struck by a sudden thought. What was the point of stressing that Aincrad was only a virtual world and a game? To Kismel and Asuna and me, this world was only reality. This game lingo, quest, merely a human language term for duty. What's wrong with that? And we'll also teach you about our human language. If we go fighting in the labyrinth, that's what we call the Pillar of Heavens, you're gonna need to know these terms. I would very much like that, Kismel replied, and I could sense Asuna smiling. Sorry about the wait. We've come to a decision, Lind announced, and the three of us looked back down the hill. The scimitar user clearly did not wish to get any closer to Kismel, but he overcame his hesitation to climb a few steps up the slope. To get right to the point, the Dragon Knights Brigade and the Aincrad Liberation Squad have both decided to abandon the campaign quest. What? I was significantly surprised, but I made sure not to let that show on my face. However, it is still necessary to investigate whether or not the benefits of the campaign might be crucial to defeating the floor boss. We would like for your group to handle that duty. What? Again, I kept my face straight. In return, I asked him, that's fine with me, but what are you going to do now? Lind looked uncomfortable, and Cabal filled the awkward silence with an angry, resigned bellow. That's obvious! We're gonna go map out the labyrinth! If we left it to y'all, someone died in an accident, I wouldn't sleep well at night. I see, I said, finally breaking my stoic expression with a wry smile. Asuna sighed and muttered, that's one way of putting it. But it was probably the best choice. The mysterious Morte did not show up, but he was probably still registered with the DKB while maintaining connections to the ALS. If both guilds continued with the campaign, it only left Morte responsible with the opportunities to fan the flames of their rivalry. I had to get the proof of Morte's plot so I could expose him publicly and force the truth out of him. Speaking of the antagonist characters, I looked around for Joe, wondering how he was taking this decision. I spotted him at the edge of the ALS group, back turned and hands folded behind his head in an obnoxious sulking pose. Once again, I couldn't help but be impressed at Cabal's leadership, that he could manage a handful like him in the guild. Rather than actually saying that aloud, I took a deep breath and turned to Lind. All right, today's the 19th, and we're planning to tackle the boss on the 21st. We'll aim to finish the campaign by the evening of the 20th and report the results. You'll have to trust our information, of course. Now it was Lind's turn to give an awkward, stiff smile. I'm not going to quibble about that at this point. Kirito earlier said that you were going to do what was needed to be done as a frontrunner. It pains me to admit, but you remind me of Diaval. He bit his lip several times before finally continuing. In the very first strategy meeting of the town of Tolbana, on the first floor, Diavel said that we had to beat the boss and get to the second floor to show everyone that the game could be beaten. That it was our duty as the best players. I thought it was carrying out his will to create the guild he would have started and raise it to be the best. That was my duty. The other DKB members, like Hafner and Shivada, and even the ALS, listened in silence to Lin's rare confession of his innermost feelings. When he raised his head again, there was a new light of determination in his eyes. He stared at me. The question that followed caught me by surprise. I think this is a good time to ask. You were the one who heard Diavel's dying words. What did he say at the very end? I couldn't answer right away. It wasn't because I had forgotten, of course, but it was such a short and obvious message that I couldn't tell if it contained what Lind was hoping to hear. Obviously, I couldn't make something up to refuse to tell him. I closed my eyes for a moment and summoned the mental image of self-styled knight face before answering. You have to take it from here. Kill the boss. That's what Diavel said. Lin's face immediately scrunched up, and he hung his head again. Eventually, his trembling voice traveled along the night breeze to my ears. We will. On this floor, and the next after that. That is why the Dragon Knights were formed. He turned back to his 5 comrades. Head still hung, and held out a clenched fist. Hafner, the sub-leader of the group, joined him, then Shivada, the swordsman, Naga with his flail, and 2 more whose names I didn't know yet, all thrusting their fists forward in a salute. When Lind turned around again, back properly straight, his face held that familiar, lofty, elite expression. He looked back at me, then Cabal, and announced stiffly, The DKB will begin tackling the labyrinth in the morning. We will meet next assembly place in Zumfoot on the 20th, 1700 hours. Good evening. Even Cabal watched without his usual sarcastic comments. At the 6 Dragon Knights marched over to the grass to the east. Finally, he summoned all his scorn and spat, Stupid brat, always looking down on us like he's so high and mighty. As if he ain't got a helping hand of Diavel's will myself. Come on, let's go. We ain't gonna stand around and let them get a jump on us. Let's go find that damn boss chamber. The other members of the ALS roared in approval, and the dozen headed off to the west. Apparently they had already set up in the base next to town. Cabal, walking at the rear of his team, proceeded about 5 yards down the slope of the hill before stopping and turning back in our direction. Hey kid! He stopped briefly and made a face like he was drinking an antidote potion. Mr. Kirito. My eyes went wide, and Asuna gurgled a sound that went something like Vroom. Fortunately, Cabal didn't seem to be paying attention to our reactions. He scratched at his cactus hair. I ain't gonna thank you 'cause you stole the quest out from under my nose. But I'm starting to get the feeling that it ain't the worst thing to the world to have a guy like you, just one, among the group. That's all. He turned back to catch up with his group, and I managed to get out one final sentence. No need to Mr. me next time. With a wave of his hand in response, the leader of the Einkrad Liberation Squad descended behind the slope of the hill and disappeared. Once the sound of their footsteps died out and there was no more color curses in view, Asuna let out a deep, long breath. I glanced over at her, and she looked up to catch my eye. I realized that I still hadn't said anything to her about the fact that I'd left to complete the quest on my own while she was sleeping. She didn't appear to be angry, but it could also be her new normal-looking, next-level rage mode. so I knew I had to bring up the topic gingerly. I'm certain you have many things to say. Of course. Right. But I'm willing to wait till we get back to base. Right. With a sigh of relief, I turned to Kismel this time. The Dark Elf Knight was staring at the direction of the ALS in silence. Then noticed my gaze and smiled. Your human Knight Brigade are not so bad after all. But they are a far cry from my Pagoda Tree Knights. Well, naturally. We just call them guilds, though. I shall remember that. But Kirito, I do not approve of this recklessness. If I had not woken and found you missing, we would not have been able to race here in time. Sorry, and thanks. So it was Kismo who had noticed first, and not Asuna. My partner must have sensed what I was thinking because she pouted and said, It was my idea to chase after you, just so you know. I figured you were up to one of those insane schemes. And I was right, just after you told me not to go antagonizing the guilds, too. Sorry, thanks. I bellowed to them deeply and removed a sheaf of parchment from my coat pocket, the commander's orders I'd stolen from the forest elf camp. Well, let's leave the labyrinth up to them and deliver this bad boy to our dear commander.